The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Henderson County Courthouse as Martinez adjusted her worn leather briefcase and checked her watch for the third time. At 73 years old, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate the world despite the challenges that came with age. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her navy blue suit, though decades old, was impeccably maintained. Had been coming to this courthouse for over 40 years, but today felt different. Today, she wasn't here as a spectator or a witness. Today, she was representing herself in a case that could determine whether she would lose the home where she had raised 3 children and buried her husband of 52 years. The courtroom was already bustling with activity when entered. Lawyers in expensive suits shuffled papers and whispered urgently to their clients. The air conditioning hummed steadily, but could feel perspiration forming on her palms. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying legal precedents in the public library and practicing her arguments in front of her bathroom mirror. Judge Harrison Blackwood entered the courtroom with the swagger of a man who had never questioned his own authority. At 48, he was relatively young for a judge, but his family's political connections had fast-tracked his career. He had a reputation for being sharp-tongued and impatient with anyone he deemed beneath his status. His black robes billowed behind him as he took his seat at the elevated bench, looking down at the assembled crowd like a king surveying his subjects. His case was the third on the docket that morning. She watched nervously as Judge Blackwood dismissed the first 2 cases with barely concealed irritation. When her name was finally called, she rose slowly, her arthritis making the simple movement more difficult than it once was. Martinez versus Sunset Development Corporation, the bailiff announced. As made her way to the defendant's table, she could hear whispers from the gallery. Some people recognized her as the woman who had been fighting the development company for months, refusing to sell her property despite increasingly aggressive offers. Others simply saw an elderly woman who looked out of place in the formal setting. The opposing counsel was everything was not. He was young, confident, and expensively dressed. His law firm represented some of the biggest corporations in the state, and he had never lost a case involving property disputes. As he organized his files at the plaintiff's table, he barely glanced in its direction. Judge Blackwood reviewed the case file with obvious boredom. He had seen dozens of similar cases over the years, usually involving elderly homeowners who were stubborn about selling to developers. In his experience, these cases were straightforward. The development companies always had the resources and legal expertise to get what they wanted, and the homeowners eventually gave in. "Mrs. Martinez," Judge Blackwood said, not bothering to look up from his papers. "I see you're representing yourself in this matter. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer to have actual legal counsel present?" Stood despite the pain in her lower back. "Your Honor, I am perfectly capable of representing myself. I have studied the relevant laws and believe I have a strong case." Judge Blackwood finally looked up and could see the condescension in his eyes. "Ma'am, with all due respect, property law is quite complex. This isn't a traffic ticket we're dealing with here. Mr. represents a legitimate development company with plans that could benefit the entire community." Stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client has made numerous generous offers to purchase Mrs. Martinez's property. She has consistently refused reasonable compensation, and we believe she is simply trying to extract more money through this frivolous lawsuit." Felt her face flush with anger, but she kept her voice steady. "Your Honor, this is not about money. This is about my legal right to remain on property that has been in my family for 3 generations. The development company has been using intimidation tactics and false claims about eminent domain." Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair and sighed dramatically. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm going to give you some free advice. You should take whatever offer these people are giving you and find yourself a nice little apartment somewhere. Fighting progress rarely ends well for folks like you." The words stung, but had expected this kind of treatment. She had dealt with condescending men in positions of power her entire life. What she hadn't expected was what Judge Blackwood said next. "You know," the judge said, turning to address the courtroom with a smirk, "this reminds me of my grandmother. She used to have this old CB radio, and her call sign was Silver Fox." She thought she was so clever, chattering away on that thing for hours. But eventually, we had to take it away when her mind started going. Sometimes you have to protect people from themselves. The courtroom fell silent, felt as though she had been slapped. The judge had just compared her to a senile old woman who needed to be managed by her family. The implication was clear. He believed she was too old and confused to understand what was best for her. Looked uncomfortable but said nothing. He knew Judge Blackwood's comment was inappropriate, but he also knew it worked in his favor. If the judge already viewed as incompetent, his case would be much easier to win. His hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the defendant's table. For a moment, she considered simply walking out of the courtroom. The humiliation was almost too much to bear. But then she thought about her late husband, Roberto, and the promise she had made to him before he died. She had sworn she would never let anyone force her from the home they had built together. The judge was still chuckling at his own joke when reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but Judge Blackwood had left her no choice. Inside the folder were documents that could change everything about this case and possibly about Judge Blackwood's career. "Your Honor," said, her voice suddenly stronger and more confident than it had been all morning. "Before we proceed with this case, I believe there are some matters of judicial ethics that need to be addressed." Judge Blackwood's smile faded slightly. "Excuse me." Opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs and documents. "I think the court should be aware of the financial relationship between Your Honor and the plaintiff's law firm." The color began to drain from Judge Blackwood's face as continued. "I also think the court should know about the vacation property in the Bahamas that was purchased by a shell company connected to Sunset Development Corporation, and how that property was then leased to Your Honor for the remarkably low rate of $1 per year." Jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, I object. This is completely irrelevant to the property dispute at hand." But Judge Blackwood wasn't paying attention to his objection. He was staring at with a mixture of shock and growing fear. How could this elderly woman possibly have obtained such detailed information about his private financial arrangements? Had spent the past 6 months doing something that no one expected a 73-year-old woman to be capable of, conducting a thorough investigation. What they didn't know was that before her retirement, had worked for 30 years as a forensic accountant for the state attorney general's office. She knew how to follow money trails, and she knew how to uncover corruption. "Where did you get these documents?" Judge Blackwood demanded, his voice no longer carrying its earlier confidence. Smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom. "Your Honor, I believe the more important question is whether these arrangements constitute a conflict of interest that should disqualify you from hearing this case." The courtroom erupted in whispers as the gallery realized what was happening. The elderly woman who had been dismissed and mocked was systematically dismantling the judge's credibility with the precision of a surgeon. Judge Blackwood looked around the courtroom desperately, as if hoping someone would come to his rescue, but even seemed to be distancing himself, gathering his papers as if preparing to make a hasty exit. "Furthermore," continued, "I have documentation showing that Sunset Development Corporation has received preferential treatment in at least 7 other cases heard in this courtroom over the past 2 years. In each case, the outcomes were unusually favorable to the company, despite questionable legal grounds." Placed another set of documents on the table in front of her. "I've already forwarded copies of all this information to the State Judicial Ethics Committee and to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. I'm sure they'll be very interested in investigating these relationships." Judge Blackwood's face had gone completely white. His hands were shaking as he realized the full implications of what was revealing. His career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom were now in jeopardy because of the woman he had just finished mocking. The bailiff stepped forward, sensing the tension in the room. Other court personnel were whispering urgently among themselves, and several people in the gallery were already pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Looked directly at Judge Blackwood, her eyes steady and unwavering. "Your Honor, I believe it would be appropriate for you to recuse yourself from this case, and perhaps you might want to consider whether there are other cases that should be reviewed as well." For the first time in his judicial career, Judge Harrison Blackwood was completely speechless. The woman he had dismissed as a confused old lady with a CB radio had just exposed a web of corruption that could bring down not only him, but several other powerful figures in the county's legal and business community. As stood waiting for his response, she thought about all the times throughout her life when men in positions of power had underestimated her. They saw an elderly woman and assumed she was weak, confused, or easily intimidated. What they failed to understand was that appearance could be deceiving, and that a lifetime of experience had taught her exactly how to fight battles that others thought were already lost. The silence in the courtroom stretched for what felt like an eternity. Judge Blackwood sat frozen at his bench, his mind racing as he tried to process the devastating information had just revealed. Sweat beads formed on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his usually commanding voice seemed to have abandoned him entirely. Remained standing, her posture straight and dignified, waiting for the judge to respond. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, but she showed no signs of the nervousness that had plagued her earlier. This was the moment she had been preparing for during months of careful investigation and sleepless nights. Finally broke the silence, his voice strained and uncertain. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess to consult with my client regarding these allegations." But Judge Blackwood wasn't listening to him. His eyes were fixed on, and she could see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out how much she actually knew. The documents she had displayed were just the tip of the iceberg, and somehow she suspected he was beginning to realize that. "Mrs. Martinez," Judge Blackwood said, his voice barely above a whisper, "these are very serious accusations you're making. I hope you understand the gravity of making false statements in a court of law." Smile was calm and confident. "Your Honor, I wouldn't make any statement in this courtroom that I couldn't support with substantial evidence. Every document I've presented has been through multiple sources, and I have additional materials that I believe will be of great interest to the appropriate authorities." She reached into her briefcase again and pulled out another folder. "For instance, I have bank records showing wire transfers from Caribbean accounts linked to Sunset Development Corporation to an account owned by Your Honor's wife. I also have photographs of Your Honor and several Sunset executives at what appears to be a very expensive private resort in the islands last year." The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. Several reporters who had been covering what they thought would be a routine property dispute were now frantically taking notes and making phone calls to their editors. This was turning into the biggest corruption scandal the county had seen in decades. Judge Blackwood's face cycled through various shades of red and white as continued her methodical destruction of his credibility. He looked toward the bailiff, as if considering having removed from the courtroom, but he knew that such an action would only make things worse for him. "How," he asked, his voice barely audible, "how did you?" His expression softened slightly, and for a moment she looked like the grandmother she was rather than the forensic accountant who was dismantling a corruption network. "Your Honor, you made the mistake of assuming that because I'm an elderly woman, I must be technologically illiterate and intellectually limited. That assumption cost you everything." She gestured toward her briefcase, which still contained several more folders. "You see, before I retired 15 years ago, I spent 3 decades tracking financial crimes for the state. I specialized in cases involving public officials who thought they were too clever to get caught. I know how to trace money through offshore accounts, shell companies, and complex trust arrangements. What you and your associates did wasn't particularly sophisticated." Was now visibly sweating, his expensive suit doing nothing to hide his discomfort. He had begun to understand that his own law firm might be implicated in whatever had uncovered. "Your Honor, I really must insist on a recess." "Mr." interrupted, turning her attention to the lawyer, "I think you should know that my investigation didn't stop with Judge Blackwood. Your firm's billing records show several instances where Sunset Development Corporation was charged for legal services that were never actually provided. Instead, those payments appear to have been directed toward what could only be described as personal expenses for various court officials." His face went ashen. His law firm represented dozens of major clients, and if their billing practices were exposed to scrutiny, it could destroy the reputation they had spent decades building. Continued, her voice steady and professional. "I have documentation of golf tournament entry fees, luxury car lease payments, and private school tuition for judges' children, all paid for by your firm but ultimately funded by Sunset Development Corporation. The pattern is quite clear once you know what to look for." Judge Blackwood finally found his voice, though it was shaky and desperate. "Mrs. Martinez, surely we can discuss this privately. There may be explanations for these apparent discrepancies that don't require involving outside authorities." Shook her head slowly. "Your Honor, the time for private discussions ended when you decided to mock me in open court. When you compared me to your senile grandmother and suggested that I needed to be protected from my own decisions, you crossed a line that I simply cannot ignore." She picked up another document from her table. "Besides, it's too late for private discussions. As I mentioned, I've already forwarded all of this information to the FBI and the State Attorney General's office. I imagine they'll be very interested in conducting their own investigation into what appears to be a systematic pattern of judicial corruption." The courtroom was now buzzing with activity. Court reporters were typing furiously, trying to capture every word of the unprecedented confrontation. Several people in the gallery were the proceedings on their phones and could see that the story was already beginning to spread beyond the confines of the courthouse. Judge Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm going to hold you in contempt of court for these disruptive and unfounded accusations." Laughed, and the sound was both musical and slightly menacing. "Your Honor, I don't think you're in any position to be holding anyone in contempt, particularly not when I have audio recordings of conversations between you and Sunset Development executives discussing how to expedite the seizure of my property." She held up a small digital recorder. "This device has been recording our entire conversation today. I suspect the media will find your earlier comments about protecting old ladies from themselves quite interesting, especially in the context of your financial relationship with the opposing party." Judge Blackwood's shoulders sagged as he finally understood the full extent of his predicament. Hadn't just stumbled upon evidence of corruption. She had conducted a sophisticated investigation that had uncovered years of illegal activity. Worse still, she had documented everything and shared it with the appropriate authorities before ever setting foot in his courtroom. Began packing her documents back into her briefcase, her movements calm and methodical. "Your Honor, I came here today prepared to argue my case based on property law and constitutional rights, but your decision to mock me and dismiss my concerns as the confusion of an old woman forced me to take a different approach." She closed her briefcase and looked directly at Judge Blackwood. "You see, there's something you and your associates never understood about people like me. We may be old, but we're not stupid. We may move slowly, but we think very clearly. And when you threaten something we care about, we're capable of fighting back in ways you never expected." Finally managed to find his voice. "Your Honor, I motion for a mistrial and request that all proceedings be suspended pending an investigation into these allegations." Turned toward him with the same calm smile. "Mister, I'm afraid a mistrial won't protect you or your firm from the criminal investigation that's already. The FBI tends to be quite thorough when it comes to public corruption cases." Judge Blackwood looked around the courtroom desperately, as if hoping to find some escape route from the disaster that was unfolding around him. The bailiff was speaking quietly into his radio and suspected that federal agents would be arriving at the courthouse very soon. "Mrs. Martinez," Judge Blackwood said, his voice now pleading rather than commanding, "what do you want? Surely we can reach some kind of arrangement." His expression hardened. "What I want, Your Honor, is exactly what I asked for when I filed this lawsuit: the right to remain in my home without harassment or intimidation. What I want is for corrupt officials like you to understand that ordinary citizens won't simply roll over and accept injustice." She paused and looked around the crowded courtroom. "But most of all, what I want is for everyone here to understand that age and appearance don't determine a person's capability or worth. The next time any of you are tempted to dismiss someone because they're old or different or don't fit your expectations, I hope you'll remember what happened here today." As spoke, the courtroom doors opened, and several men in dark suits entered. Recognized them immediately as federal agents, and she could see Judge Blackwood's face go completely white as he realized that his worst fears were about to be realized. The lead agent approached the bench and spoke quietly to Judge Blackwood, who nodded numbly and stood up on shaky legs. As they escorted him from the courtroom, could hear the frantic clicking of camera phones and the excited chatter of reporters who knew they were witnessing the biggest story of their careers. Was gathering his papers frantically, clearly preparing to leave as quickly as possible, but suspected it was too late for him to escape the consequences of his firm's involvement in the corruption scheme. As the courtroom slowly emptied, remained seated at the defendant's table, calmly reviewing her notes. She had accomplished what she came here to do, though not in the way she had originally planned. Her home was safe, The corrupt officials had been exposed, and justice had been served in a way that no one could have predicted. 6 months after the dramatic courtroom confrontation that had shaken Henderson County to its core, Martinez sat in her favorite chair on the front porch of her home, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The house that had once been threatened by developers now stood as a symbol of resistance and justice, its modest frame structure becoming the subject of newspaper articles and documentaries. The aftermath of that day in court had exceeded even expectations. Judge Harrison Blackwood was no longer sitting on any bench. Instead, he was facing federal charges for bribery, corruption, and conspiracy. His expensive vacation home in the Bahamas had been seized by federal authorities, and his law license had been permanently revoked. The man who had once looked down on with such condescension was now facing the possibility of spending the next 15 years in federal prison. His law firm had fared no better. The FBI's investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that stretched far beyond its case. Multiple partners at the firm had been indicted, and the once prestigious practice had collapsed under the weight of scandal and lawsuits from clients whose cases had been compromised by the firm's unethical practices. Himself had accepted a plea deal that would send him to prison for 5 years in exchange for his cooperation with ongoing investigations. Sunset Development Corporation had faced even harsher consequences. The revelation of their bribery scheme had triggered investigations by multiple state and federal agencies. The company's executives were facing criminal charges, their development projects had been shut down, and the corporation was in bankruptcy proceedings. The aggressive tactics they had used against and dozens of other property owners had ultimately led to their complete destruction. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the broader impact her actions had created. The corruption she had exposed had led to a complete overhaul of the county's judicial system. New ethics rules had been implemented, financial disclosure requirements had been strengthened, and an independent oversight committee had been established to monitor judicial conduct. Several other judges who had been part of the corruption network had been removed from office, and the entire legal community had been forced to confront the extent of the rot that had infected their system. His phone had been ringing constantly for months. Reporters wanted interviews, documentary filmmakers wanted to tell her story, and dozens of other people who had been victimized by corrupt officials wanted her help with their own cases. She had become something of a folk hero, the elderly woman who had taken on the system and won. The irony wasn't lost on that Judge Blackwood's cruel joke about her being like his grandmother with a CB radio had actually contained more truth than he realized. Did have a CB radio, though she hadn't mentioned it during the trial. What the judge didn't know was that she had been using it for years to coordinate with a network of retired law enforcement officers, accountants, and investigators who had been quietly documenting corruption throughout the state. Her call sign was indeed Silver Fox, just as Judge Blackwood had mockingly suggested. But unlike his grandmother, his mind was razor-sharp, and her radio network had been instrumental in gathering the evidence that brought down the corruption scheme. The retired officers in her network had contacts throughout various law enforcement agencies, and they had been the ones who helped her navigate the complex process of reporting the corruption to the appropriate authorities. Smiled as she remembered the look on Judge Blackwood's face when he realized the full extent of what she had uncovered. He had expected to deal with a confused old woman who would meekly accept whatever judgment he handed down. Instead, he had encountered a professional investigator with decades of experience and a network of allies who shared her commitment to justice. The legal victory had been important, but knew that the real significance of what had happened went far beyond her own case. Across the country, other elderly people had been inspired by her story to stand up against discrimination and abuse. Support groups had formed, legal aid organizations had increased their outreach to senior citizens, and there had been a measurable decrease in the number of cases where developers tried to use intimidation tactics against elderly property owners. Had received hundreds of letters from people thanking her for showing them that age didn't have to mean powerlessness. Many of the letters came from women who had faced similar situations and had found the courage to fight back after hearing story. Others came from younger people who had been inspired to treat elderly citizens with greater respect and to recognize the wisdom and experience that came with age. The media attention had also brought unexpected opportunities. Had been invited to speak at law schools about ethics and corruption, and several universities had offered her honorary degrees in recognition of her service to justice. A major publisher had approached her about writing a book about her experience, and she was seriously considering the offer. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from the state attorney general, who had created a new position specifically for special advisor on public corruption. The role would allow her to work with law enforcement agencies to identify and investigate corruption cases throughout the state. At 73, was embarking on what amounted to a second career, one that would put her investigative skills to use in service of the public good. Children had initially been worried about the stress and publicity that came with her newfound fame, but they had quickly realized that their mother was thriving in ways they hadn't seen since their father's death. The legal battle had given her a sense of purpose and had reconnected her with the investigative work that had always been her passion. Her son Carlos, who lived in Chicago, had flown down to visit shortly after the trial. He had always known his mother was intelligent and capable, but he had never fully understood the extent of her professional skills until he saw the meticulous documentation she had compiled during her investigation. "Mom," he had said as they sat together on the same porch where now watched the sunrise, "I had no idea you were capable of something like this." Had laughed and patted his hand. "Just because I'm old doesn't mean I'm helpless. I spent 30 years catching criminals for the state. Did you think I forgot how to do that just because I retired?" The conversation with her son had highlighted something important that had been thinking about ever since the trial. Society's tendency to dismiss elderly people wasn't just cruel. It was also incredibly wasteful. People had decades of experience and knowledge that could be valuable resources for their communities, but too often they were pushed aside and ignored simply because of their age. Had decided to make addressing this issue part of her mission in her new role. She was working with advocacy groups to develop programs that would connect retired professionals with organizations that could benefit from their expertise. She was also pushing for changes in how the legal system treated elderly victims and witnesses, ensuring that their voices would be heard and respected. The house behind buzzed with activity as members of her CB radio network arrived for their weekly meeting. What had started as an informal group of retirees sharing information had evolved into a sophisticated citizen watchdog organization. They tracked government spending, monitored public meetings, and investigated reports of corruption and abuse throughout the region. His friend, a retired FBI agent, arrived carrying a box of files. "Silver Fox, we've got some interesting developments in that city council case you've been tracking," she said, using his call sign even in person. Stood and stretched, feeling remarkably energetic despite her age. The month since the trial had been exhausting but invigorating, and she felt more alive than she had in years. "Let's see what those politicians have been up to now," she said with a grin. As they headed inside, reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when she had walked up the courthouse steps feeling nervous and uncertain. The woman who had been mocked and dismissed by Judge Blackwood had become a formidable force for justice, and her story had inspired countless others to stand up for what was right. The phone rang as they entered the house, and could see from the caller ID that it was another reporter requesting an interview. She had become selective about media appearances, but she still made time for interviews when she thought they could help spread awareness about the issues she cared about. "Mrs. Martinez," the reporter said when she answered, "I'm calling to follow up on the sentencing hearing for Judge Blackwood. Do you have any comments on the 15-year sentence he received?" Considered her words carefully. She felt no joy in seeing another human being sent to prison, but she also believed that justice required consequences for those who abused their power. "I think the sentence reflects the seriousness of Judge Blackwood's crimes," she said. "When public officials violate the trust that citizens place in them, they must be held accountable." The reporter pressed for more details about her reaction to the sentencing, but kept her comments brief and professional. She had learned that her words carried weight now, and she was careful to use that influence responsibly. After hanging up, joined her friends in the living room where they were spreading out documents and maps related to their current investigations. The work they were doing was important, but knew that their greatest achievement was simply proving that elderly citizens could be powerful agents of change when they chose to act. As the morning progressed and more members of the network arrived, looked around the room at the assembled group of retired professionals. There were former police officers, teachers, accountants, engineers, and social workers, all united by their refusal to accept that retirement meant irrelevance. Judge Blackwood's mocking comment about protecting old people from themselves had revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what aging really meant. Getting older didn't make people helpless or confused. It gave them wisdom, experience, and often the freedom to speak truth to power without fear of consequences. Thought about all the other silver foxes around the country who were fighting their own battles against injustice and discrimination. Her story had shown that one person, regardless of age, could make a difference when they refused to back down from what was right. The sun climbed higher in the sky as and her team got to work on their latest investigation. There were still corrupt officials to expose, still battles to fight, and still people who needed someone to stand up for them. Martinez, the woman who had been dismissed as a confused old lady, was just getting started.